The morning it happened, nobody saw it coming. Not the banker who had smiled and shaken his hand across a mahogany desk just 3 years before. Not the neighbors who had watched him build what they called the finest cattle operation in 4 counties. Not even his own wife, who had stood beside him through drought and flood, and the kind of silence that only farmers know. The silence of standing in a field and wondering if the rain will ever come. Nobody saw it coming. And that is exactly the point. Because the thing about ruin is, it never announces itself. It doesn't knock on your door in the morning and say, "Today is the day your life falls apart." It comes quietly, the way a crack moves through ice, invisible at first, spreading beneath the surface, until one morning you take one more step and the whole thing give way beneath you. Stay with me until the end. This story will change the way you think about money and what it really means to win. Before we begin, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. Henry Calloway was 41 years old the morning the ground gave way. He had been farming for 19 years. Not the hobby farming that wealthy men do on weekends, not the gentleman farming of someone who has a trust fund to fall back on. Real farming. The kind where you wake before sunrise every single day of your life, where your hands are never fully clean, where you go to bed calculating rainfall and commodity prices instead of sleeping, where every decision you make is one bad harvest away from catastrophe. Henry had started with nothing, literally nothing. His father had died when he was 22, leaving behind $14,000 in debt and 60 acres of exhausted land in eastern Montana that hadn't grown a profitable crop in a decade. Most men would have sold it. Most men would have walked away, taken a job in town, and let someone else figure out what to do with 60 acres of hard dirt at the edge of nowhere. Henry didn't walk away. He spent the first 3 years rebuilding the soil, rotating crops that nobody grew anymore, learning techniques that old farmers had forgotten and young farmers had never bothered to learn. He read everything he could find. He drove 4 hours to attend a soil science lecture at the State University, sat in the back row, the only person there without a college degree, and took 40 pages of notes that he still has to this day. By the time he was 30, he had paid off his father's debt. By 35, he had expanded to 180 acres. By 38, he had the most productive operation in the county, 340 acres of land that yielded more per acre than farms twice its size, a small herd of cattle that had won regional quality awards 2 years running, and, this is the part that matters, not a single dollar of operating debt. That last part. Hold on to that, because that is the part that the banker didn't understand when he came calling in the spring of Henry's 38th year. The bank was offering something they called a growth opportunity package. Essentially, it was a loan, a large one, designed specifically for farmers who had proven they knew what they were doing and were ready, the banker explained, to take the next step. The next step. Henry had heard that phrase his entire life. His neighbors were always talking about the next step, the expansion, the new equipment, the additional acreage that would finally make everything come together. He had watched those same neighbors, the ones always chasing the next step, take out loans, buy land at peak prices, upgrade equipment they didn't need, and then spend the next decade trying to outrun the interest payments. He said no to the banker. Politely, but no. The banker hadn't expected that. He had spreadsheets, he had projections, he had a whole presentation prepared about how Henry's operation was under-leveraged, a word that always made Henry slightly sick to his stomach because it turned debt into something that sounded like a missed opportunity instead of a trap. The banker explained that the interest rate was historically low, that land values in the region were projected to continue rising, that this was precisely the moment for a farmer like Henry to scale up. Henry said no again, and this time, less. Politely, what he said was, "My father died owing money to a bank. I made a promise at his grave that I never would. And I'm going to keep that promise even if it means I stay small forever." The banker left. But the story got around. And in the way that small communities have of turning a man's principles into a punchline, Henry Calloway became known, quietly, in the way these things happen, in the conversations at the feed store and the diner and the edge of the grain. Elevator parking lot, as the man who was too scared to grow, too small-minded to take a chance, too stubborn to understand the modern way of farming. Marcus Webb understood the modern way of farming. Marcus was everything Henry wasn't. Loud, where Henry was quiet. Expansive, where Henry was contained. Borrowed, where Henry saved. Marcus had started with 800 acres his family had farmed for 3 generations, and in 15 years of strategic growth, his words, always his words, had turned it into 4,600 acres of the most debt-laden farmland in the state. Marcus had 4 tractors, each costing more than most people's houses. He had a combine harvester that he had bought new for $380,000 and which he used approximately 6 weeks a year. He had a grain storage facility that could hold enough corn to feed a small city, financed entirely on a credit line that required monthly interest payments that would have taken Henry 3 months to earn. Marcus wore ostrich skin boots. He drove a truck with a back seat big enough to comfortably seat 6 adults. He talked about his operation in numbers, acreage, yield, gross revenue, the way some men talk about sports statistics, rapid and fluent and completely disconnected from what the numbers actually mean. What they actually meant, though nobody who worked for Marcus, or borrowed money beside Marcus, or attended the same Farm Bureau dinners as Marcus was prepared to say out loud, was this: Marcus Webb was 1 bad year away from losing everything, and that is the thing about debt. It is patient in a way that people are not. It sits there, compounding, accruing, waiting. It doesn't care that you had 4 good years in a row. It doesn't care that you know what you're doing. It doesn't care that everyone respects you and your operation is impressive and your boots cost more than most people's monthly rent. It just sits there, adding to itself quietly until the moment when everything that was propping it up shifts. Commodity prices, interest rates, weather, demand, and suddenly the weight of it becomes impossible to carry. Henry knew this. He had known it since he was 22 years old, standing at his father's grave, staring at a piece of paper that listed debts he hadn't known existed. But knowing something and being able to protect yourself from the mockery of people who think you're a fool for knowing it, those are 2 very different things. The night Marcus Webb stood up at the County Farm Bureau dinner and, in front of 200 people, told a story about the farmer who was too scared to borrow $1, everyone in the room knew who he was talking about. Marcus didn't use Henry's name. He didn't have to. He described a man who thinks debt is the enemy, who farms like it's still 1952, who won't ever amount to anything because he's too busy being afraid. People laughed, not all of them, but enough. Henry was sitting 4 tables away. He heard every word. He watched Marcus gesture and grin and play to the room like a man who has never once in his life considered that the audience might someday stop laughing with him and start watching him fall. Henry looked down at his plate. He thought about his father. He thought about 60 acres of exhausted land and $14,000 in debt and the decision he had made at 22 to do things differently, to go slowly, to build something that could survive the bad years because it hadn't overextended in the good ones. He didn't respond. He didn't stand up and defend himself. He didn't tell Marcus Webb what he thought of ostrich skin boots and $380,000 combines and a credit line that was 1 interest rate hike away from catastrophe. He went home. He sat on his porch in the dark Montana night and he made himself a quiet, private, absolute promise. He would still be here when Marcus Webb's empire fell, because debt always comes due. The only question is, who's left standing when it does? That was the spring of 2008. What happened next? What happened to Marcus? What happened to Henry? What happened to the 4,600 acres that Marcus thought he owned, but the bank actually owned? That story starts the following year. And it is the kind of story that sounds impossible until you understand one simple, ancient, unbreakable truth. The man who owes nothing fears nothing, and the man who fears nothing cannot be stopped. Chapter C. When the empire falls, who is left standing? They say the signs were there. Looking back, everyone always says the signs were there. The commodity prices that had seemed so stable began to soften in late 2008. Not dramatically at first, not the kind of drop that makes headlines or causes panic, just a quiet, steady, downward drift, the kind that doesn't alarm anyone until they look at their numbers at the end of the month and realize the margin they were counting on has disappeared. Then the input costs started rising. Fuel, fertilizer, seed, the things you cannot farm without, began climbing faster than the prices you could get for what you grew. And then, the thing that nobody who had borrowed at variable rates had wanted to think about. Interest rates shifted. Not catastrophically, not overnight. Just enough. Just enough that the careful calculations Marcus Webb had made when he signed the loan documents, the ones showing comfortable margins between his income and his debt service, stopped working. The math that had seemed so solid became, almost overnight, a different kind of math entirely. Henry Calloway heard about it in pieces. First, it was Marcus selling one of the 4 tractors. People noticed, you can't sell a $200,000 tractor in a small county without people noticing. But it was explained away as a practical decision, consolidation, operational efficiency. Marcus's phrase. He always had a phrase. Then it was the laying off of 2 of his full-time workers, men who had worked for Marcus for years, families with children in the local schools. That was harder to explain away. Marcus didn't try. He just stopped coming to the Farm Bureau dinners for a while. Then came the story that traveled through the county the way bad news always travels, faster than good news, quieter than rumors, more certain than gossip. Marcus Webb had missed a payment. Not a big one, not the kind of payment that triggers immediate action, but a payment. And in the arithmetic of high-stakes agricultural debt, a missed payment is not just a financial event, it is a signal. It tells the bank something that all the spreadsheets and projections and growth opportunity packages in the world cannot obscure. The man on the other side of this loan is in trouble. Banks do not like trouble. Banks, whatever they may tell you, when they are smiling across mahogany desks and offering you growth opportunity packages, are not in the business of farming. They are not in the business of weather or commodity prices or the extraordinary complexity of keeping a large agricultural operation profitable across years that are never the same. They are in the business of getting paid back. And when they begin to believe they might not be getting paid back, they move. They moved on Marcus Webb in the winter of 2010. The foreclosure proceedings were filed in January. By February, they were public record. By March, everyone in 4 counties knew that Marcus Webb's empire, 4,600 acres, 4 tractors, one $380,000 combine, grain storage facility, ostrich skin boots and all, was going to be sold to pay back the people who had actually owned it all along. Henry found out on a Tuesday morning at the grain elevator. A man he had known for 20 years told him without preamble the way men in those communities share important information, directly, without drama, as a fact. Webb's losing it all, the man said. Auctions in April. Henry nodded. He thanked the man. He bought the supplies he had come for. He drove home. That evening, he did something he had been doing, quietly, methodically, for the previous 19 years. He opened the ledger he kept in the drawer of his kitchen table, an actual physical ledger, handwritten, the kind his father had kept, and he looked at the number at the bottom of the most recent page. $412,000 saved, not borrowed, not leveraged, not strategic equity, saved. Dollar by dollar, year by year, through the drought of 2003 and the price collapse of 2006 and the equipment failure of 2009 that cost him $30,000 he didn't plan to spend. Through the years when neighbors were expanding and people were calling him too scared to grow. Through Farm Bureau dinners where a man in ostrich skin boots used him as the punchline of a joke about ambition, $412,000, sitting in accounts so ordinary and boring and unheroic that no banker had ever called them a growth opportunity. Just money. His money. owed to no one. He sat with that number for a long time. Then he made some phone calls. The auction was held on a Thursday in April, the kind of Montana spring day that can't decide whether it wants to be winter or not. Cold, intermittently bright, with a wind that cuts through even a good coat. The auction barn was packed. People came from across the region, some to bid, most to witness. The fall of something large draws a crowd, human nature. We tell ourselves we're there for information, for opportunity, for the practical business of agricultural commerce. But the truth is that watching an empire collapse is one of the few spectacles that can make even decent people feel something complicated, something that is not quite satisfaction and not quite grief, but lives in the uncomfortable space between them. Marcus Webb was there. He sat in the third row, not the front, where he had always sat when he was the buyer rather than the sold. He was wearing a plain jacket, dark, nothing special. The boots were different, not the ostrich skin. Funds, just regular boots, good ones, but regular. His face was the face of a man who has been through the specific exhaustion of months of fighting something he couldn't stop. Not broken, exactly, but changed, altered in some fundamental way that everyone who looked at him could see, but nobody could have precisely described. Henry arrived early. He sat in the middle section, unremarkable, just a farmer among farmers. Several people nodded to him. He nodded back. He didn't make conversation. When the equipment came up first, Henry watched the prices and said nothing. He was not here for equipment. He had the equipment he needed. When they got to the land, he got still. The first parcel, 640 acres of Marcus's best bottomland, opened at $180 per acre. The corporate buyers, there were 3 groups of them from out of state, the kind of companies that specialize in acquiring distressed agricultural assets and either farming them through tenant arrangements or holding them for appreciation. Let the opening bid sit for a moment, feeling the room, the way experienced auction buyers do, letting the silence communicate that they were not in a hurry, that they could wait. Henry raised his hand. $180. The room shifted. Not dramatically. There was no gasp, no theatrical moment. Just a subtle change in the quality of attention. The way a room changes when something unexpected but significant happens. Marcus Webb turned around. He looked at Henry Calloway for the first time since the Farm Bureau dinner, where he had used Henry as a punchline about fear. And in Marcus Webb's face, in that moment, was something Henry had never seen there before. Recognition. Not of Henry specifically. He had always known who Henry was. But recognition of something larger. Recognition of what it meant, that the man sitting in the middle of the auction barn, the man who had been too scared to borrow $1, the man who farmed like it was 1952, the man who would never amount to anything. Recognition of what it meant that this man was here, bidding with real money on land that Marcus had spent 15 years building an empire to acquire and had lost in 2 years of debt service he couldn't manage. The corporate buyers came back. They took it to $220 an acre. Henry said $240 back and forth. Each time, Henry waited exactly as long as he needed to wait, no longer. He didn't show excitement. He didn't lean forward. He just sat there steady and said his number when it was time to say it. At $310 an acre for 640 acres, just under $200,000, the corporate buyers made the calculation that they were not going to get the deal they needed at this price and stepped back. The land they wanted would come available again. It always did. They had other auctions. Sold, the auctioneer said, to the gentleman in the middle. The second parcel went similarly. And the third. Henry didn't bid on everything. He couldn't, and he had not planned to. He was strategic about which parcels and what prices. The consortium he had organized, 11 other small farmers from the county, each of whom had been, like him, careful and quiet and mocked for it, had pooled specific amounts for specific parcels, with a plan for each piece of land that had nothing to do with empire building and everything to do with sustainability. By the end of the auction, Henry Calloway and his consortium of 11 quiet farmers had purchased 1/800 acres of what had been Marcus Webb's operation. Not all of it. The corporate buyers got some, and a regional farming cooperative acquired another portion, but 1,800 acres. At prices that reflected what the land was actually worth in 2010, not what Marcus had paid for it at the peak of the boom. When the paperwork was done and Henry stood to leave, he had to walk past Marcus Webb. He could have walked another way. There was another exit. He knew Marcus was sitting there. He knew what it would mean, what it would look like to walk past him. He also knew what it would mean to avoid him. He walked past him. Marcus stood up as he approached. His jaw was tight. His eyes were the eyes of a man doing the most difficult thing a human being can do, holding himself together when everything that defined him is gone. "Calloway," he said. His voice was controlled, barely. "Webb," Henry said. A pause. The kind of pause that contains everything two men have never said to each other. "You planned this," Marcus said. It wasn't quite an accusation. It was more like a man recognizing, slowly, the shape of something he hadn't seen while it was happening. "I saved," Henry said. "I waited. I trusted that what you were doing wasn't sustainable. I didn't know it would be your land specifically. I just knew that somewhere, sometime, land would come available at real prices, and I wanted to be ready." Marcus looked at him. "The dinner," he said. "The thing I said at the dinner." "It didn't matter," Henry said. And he meant it. "I wasn't doing any of this because of what you said. I was doing it because of what my father taught me." "What did your father teach you?" Henry was quiet for a moment. Through the windows of the auction barn, you could see the Montana sky beginning to clear, that cold, high, absolutely blue sky that feels like it goes up forever. "He taught me that debt is the one thing you can always avoid," Henry said, "and that everything else, the hard years, the bad prices, the people who think you're a fool, everything else you can survive. But debt compounds. It grows when you're not watching. And someday, it presents the bill for everything you borrowed against the future." Marcus nodded slowly. Not agreement, exactly, but recognition. The expensive, painful recognition of a man who has learned something too late. "What happens to the land?" Marcus asked. "The parcels you bought." "We're breaking most of it into family-sized pieces, selling to people who were squeezed out during the boom years. Owner financing at rates people can actually manage. A few parcels we'll farm ourselves, in the consortium, to fund the financing." Henry paused. The goal was never to build an empire. The goal was to keep land in the hands of people who will actually farm it. Marcus was quiet for a long time. "My grandfather homesteaded 200 of those acres," he said finally. Henry looked at him. He thought about his own father. About 60 acres of exhausted land and $14,000 in debt. About the promise he had made at a grave. "I know," Henry said. He reached into his jacket and took out an envelope. He had thought about this moment for a long time. He had gone back and forth on it, argued with himself, considered the alternatives. He had thought about what his father would have done. He had thought about what kind of man he wanted to be. He handed Marcus the envelope. Inside was a simple document, a 5-year lease for the 200 acres that had originally been homesteaded by Marcus's grandfather at a rental rate well below market, low enough that a man with no savings but genuine skill and knowledge of that land could afford it. If he was careful, if he was willing to start over, if he was willing to do things differently than he had done them before. "You know that land better than anyone," Henry said. "If you want to farm it, farm it. Pay me what you can. In 5 years, if you've built up savings, I'll offer you a purchase option at fair value." Marcus Webb stared at the document in his hands for a long time. His face was unreadable. Or rather, it contained too many things to read, relief and shame, and something that might eventually become gratitude, and underneath all of it, the particular grief of a man who is only now understanding everything he didn't understand when he was building his empire. He looked up. "Why?" Henry picked up his hat from the chair beside him. He thought about the Farm Bureau dinner, and the laughter, and the walk home, and the years of quiet work, and the coffee can by the back door where he kept the ledger, and his father's voice in his memory saying words that had turned out to be the most valuable inheritance a man had ever received. Because being right, Henry said, was never the point. The point was to still be here, to still be farming, to have something to offer when the moment came. He put on his hat. You can either spend your whole life proving that people who laughed at you were wrong, or you can spend it building something that makes the question irrelevant. He walked out of the auction barn into the April air. Behind him, he heard Marcus Webb sit back down heavily. He heard what might have been a man finally, completely, letting go of what he had spent 15 years holding. Henry didn't look back. He had land to farm, and not a dollar of debt to anyone on earth. That is the whole of it. And the truth of it, and the lesson of it, if you are willing to hear it. The man who builds slowly, who saves when others spend, who stays small when the world tells him to grow, who endures the mockery of people who have confused loudness with strength and debt with power. That man, if he is patient enough, will one day find himself standing exactly where he always knew he would stand, on his own land, with his own money, answering to no one, and the empires that laughed at him? They are all, eventually, just parcels at an auction. Stay patient. Stay free. Build the kind of life that doesn't depend on anyone else's goodwill to survive, because the only revenge that lasts is the one you build dollar by dollar, year by year, in the quiet that other people mistake for defeat. It isn't defeat. It never was. It was always the plan.